the power strip at the base. So good afternoon. My name is Stephanie Morman. I'm just going to say family to the Goodells. If I try to explain the family relationships, it will take an hour. So we're just going to skip that part. And so thank you for letting me come and talk about what I definitely think is a trip of a lifetime. When I got to go to Israel with my church, St. Hilary Parish in Fairlawn, Ohio, we were one of the deacons at our church owns a company called Incredible Journeys, and this was a trip that they have done for years, pre-COVID. This was the first opportunity we had to go back to Israel once COVID kind of, died down. So it was the first opportunity that we had in many years. And someone asked me earlier, how did I get to take this trip? How did I get the opportunity? Well, a good friend of mine, Rick Zales, and another friend, Mike Zarina, we volunteer at St. Bernard's Hunger Center in Akron. And we all cook, a couple times. In fact, I'm leaving here this afternoon to go to St. Bernard's. We were out to dinner one night, and we were talking about Israel, because Mike and a couple of our other friends had been to Israel before. And Rick and I were joking about the fact that if we ever get an opportunity to go, he said, you have to come with me, because his wife, Linda, refuses to travel internationally. She just doesn't like it, is not a fan, doesn't like airports, doesn't like security, refuses to travel. And after that conversation, of course, I said, well, sure, who wouldn't want to go to Israel? A week and a half later, we got an opportunity to go to Israel. And he immediately texted me when we found out about it and said, okay, we're going. Okay, I'm going. And so that's how I got the opportunity. So let me see if there you go. Did that work? All right. Yes. I know not someone you usually quote in a church, but if you only live once, if you do it right, once is enough. So I want to stress that what I'm going to talk about is really 30,000, maybe 50,000 foot view of the time that I spent in Israel. I cannot cover anything with enough justice in 45 minutes, or an hour, or even 2 days. So I'm going to try to touch on the majority of the sites that we visited, some of the scripture that's relative, some of the archaeological evidence, some of the history, things that were at the particular sites that we have an opportunity to see. I could easily talk for days about it. And it's funny, every night, we all come back to the same place. We all had breakfast and dinner and all of our meals together. There's about 38 of us in the total group. And we would sit at dinner and joke that, well, there's no way tomorrow can top today. I mean, what did we just see? It's life-changing. And well, then the next day happened. And it did. And it topped. Every day was just better than the last. So I'm hoping I'm able to communicate some of that to you, and I hope that you enjoy, and please feel free to ask questions. We're clearly a very small group. So if there's something that I'm talking about that you have a question on, just shout it out. We've got time. Yes, ma'am. Did
you already have a passport?
No, I had to get one. It took me about 4 months to get it. But I had a passport previously, but it had long expired. And so as soon as I said, okay, yes, I'm going, that was the first thing that I did, was have to get my passport renewed. Yeah, okay. All right, so, and I have to put my old lady glasses on to be able to read this. Okay, so just a little bit about the places that we visited. Like I said before, I can't talk in depth about all of these cities and towns. The trip was a total of 11 days. 2 of those days were dedicated simply to travel. We flew from Cleveland to Newark, and then from Newark to Tel Aviv. On the way there, Newark to Tel Aviv is a 10.5-hour flight. And it's overnight, so we boarded the plane about 6 o'clock in the evening and landed at Tel Aviv 9:30 a.m. the following day. And we loaded a bus and went to the first stop. I did not sleep a wink the entire flight. Watched a lot of movies. The first 5 nights, you'll see a lot of, cluster up here. The first 5 nights we spent in and around Galilee. We stayed in Ofkinosar in Gennesaret, which is a hotel to the first Israeli kibbutz in that part of Galilee. And we stayed at the hotel there, which is right on the sea. So every morning we got to get up and watch the sunrise over the Sea of Galilee, which was incredible. The remainder of the trip then, we traveled down to Jerusalem and spent the last few nights down in and around Jerusalem. How far? It took us, so I couldn't tell you an exact mileage. I could look it up, but it took us better part of a day, because we stayed up here in Nufkinisar, and then when we decided to make the transition down to Jerusalem, we drove along the Jordan River, which is right here. It connects, it actually comes way up north. You'll see in a couple of slides where it originates, where the Jordan River originates. Flows into the Sea of Galilee, and then flows all the way down the border between Israel and Jordan to the Dead Sea, which is down here. And so we took our time kind of going to a few places. We stopped in Qumran. We stopped and overlooked Jericho. We didn't go into Jericho. Jericho is not in friendly territory to Israelis, so we cannot cross the border. But we did get to see Jordan and Jericho. But then when we got to Jerusalem, it was in the evening. The sun was starting to go down. So it took us a day to just make stops. But again, we stayed in Qumran for probably 4 or 5 hours, had lunch there, overlooking the Dead Sea. We didn't get to go to the Dead Sea in this particular trip. Previous pilgrimages have done that, but we spent time in other places, and I wouldn't have traded it for the world, the places that we did get to see, which obviously there's a lot of them that you can see there. So I'm going to start with the very first place that we visited. Once we landed, we went to Mount Carmel. Does anyone know the significance of Mount Carmel? This is an interactive part of the presentation. There's going to be a lot of that because I don't like to just stand up here and talk. Interact with me. Anybody know? Okay. It's not Moses. That's not Moses. It's the prophet Elijah. It's Elijah. Yeah, it's Elijah. So Mount Carmel is actually part of a mountain range. Let's see if I can pronounce this without, it's in Arabic, Der al-Muhaqra, which means fire or burned place. In Israel, all along the tour, our guide Shira would tell us if this was an A site, which means they absolutely know this is the place. A B site, a lot of evidence says it could be, but it also says maybe it's over there. A C site as well, that's just historically how we've always recognized it. This is an A site. So this particular site is, there's both archaeological, historical, and scriptural evidence that this is the place where all of these events took place. This is a site where King Ahab had built a palace of worship for his wife Jezebel, who worshipped Baal and Asherah, which were two pagan gods. And they were the gods of weather, as chance would have it. As punishment for King Ahab and Jezebel's wicked ways, God, instituted a severe drought. And Elijah told King Ahab it would not rain until he repented and changed his ways. So after 3 years of this drought had gone on, God sent Elijah back to the king, and Elijah challenged the prophets of the gods Baal and Asherah to a challenge. And this challenge was that both sides would build an altar, and they would sacrifice a bull and put it on the altar. But they could not light it. They had to pray to their gods, which their gods were the god of weather, to bring down fire from heaven and light the sacrifice. And so Elijah allowed the prophets of the pagan gods to go first. So they built their altar, they sacrificed their bull, and they prayed. They prayed all day, they prayed all to noon, they prayed into the night. Nothing happened. So at this point, Elijah was starting to, razz them a little bit and say, come on, you've got 450 prophets here. Surely, if your God was the real God, he would bring fire down. So Elijah finally said, all right, it's my turn. So he had his servants fill up 7 jugs of water and douse the altar and the bull and the surrounding area with water. Gallons upon gallons upon gallons of water. And then Elijah prayed to God, and so what happened? You see in this right here, fire came down from heaven, burned the altar that had been doused with water, completely burned the stones, completely burned all the surrounding ground around the altar. And in fact, the stones that you see here along this wall, these are burned stones that were found at the top of Mount Carmel. And that's what they used to build the walls of the monastery that stands there today. Pretty cool. So you think, gosh, that's how we're starting this trip. Okay, this is going to be interesting. Very, very, very cool. Again, I can't go into all the detail, but it was a very, very interesting. Oops. Why can't I go to the next slide? There we go. Okay. So after we left Mount Carmel, we started heading towards the Sea of Galilee, which is where we're going to stay for the first 5 nights of our trip. And our guide, Shira, had us pull off, had Yudi, Yehuda is our bus driver, Yudi for short, had him pull off the side of the road, and we stopped in front of a tomb. These things are all over Israel. It was amazing to me. This was literally just on the side of the highway. And obviously it's what a tomb would have looked like, the tomb that Jesus was buried in. So the thing that I didn't really have in my head, I mean, we've seen pictures, we've seen reenactments of what a tomb would look like, right? It's very small, very short to the ground. If you think about it, they were carved out of rock. Of course they're not going to make the opening like 6 feet tall so a man can walk through. That would take forever. Think about the tools they had to carve stone. So they're very short, very small to the ground. And I don't know if you can tell or not, but let me see if I can get this to show up. Okay, so obviously here's the stone. Right here, there's a really dark stone. Can you see that? If you can see in the pictures. And there's actually a trench. You see there's like weeds growing out of the trench. That is the trench that was carved into the rock that the stone would roll into. So they would pull out this dark stone, roll the stone, and then put that little stone on the other side of it, and that's what would hold it sealed shut. Does that make sense? I didn't think about that until I saw this. But it's not, to me, it's not what I pictured. When I pictured, the tomb and the resurrection story, this is not what I had in my head. So it was really interesting to see it. And literally, it was just sitting on the side of the road. It was cool. So anyway, that day, we got to our hotel in Nofki Nassar. Again, it was right on the sea. It was dark by the time we got there, so we really couldn't see. We just went in, we had dinner. We were all exhausted and tired because we had just, some of us hadn't slept in 24 hours, 48 hours by that point. So we were tired. We went to bed early. But we all agreed the next morning, the first thing we wanted to do was get up before sunrise and get down to the sea and watch the sun come up over the Sea of Galilee. We all agreed that was the first thing we wanted to do. So this was the Sea of Galilee the first morning. Now, it was very cloudy. We did not see a sunrise. But I will tell you, the very first time that I laid eyes on the Sea of Galilee, I had no idea that I was crying. And my friend looked at me and put his arm around me. He's like, "Are you okay?" And I'm like, tears were running down my face. to know that I was standing in this place that you hear about, that you read about in Bible stories. When I was a kid, when I was a young adult, to me, they were stories. We hear about things, you hear about, we could recite Bible stories from when we were kids, right? It's not a story, right? It actually was there. And to know that you stand at the Sea of Galilee and within 30 miles of where you're standing, 85% of Jesus' ministry happened right there. It took my breath away. It really did, really did. And to me, this was the perfect way to see the sea for the first time, because it was calm, it was peaceful, it was quiet, and it was just awe-inspiring to see that first morning. And I have tons of pictures, which I can't show all of them to you, of the beautiful blue skies and the gorgeous scenery around the sea. But it was really, really amazing. So then that first day, we started in and around the sea for some of our stops. And the first one we went to was Mount Beatitude, which is where Jesus preached his Sermon on the Mount. So this is Mount Aramis, and this is a B site because there's evidence that it could also have been Mount Arbel, which is very close. There's not a lot of description in the scriptures. It's a high place close to the sea, right? Well, there's a few of those. Some of the topography, this place makes more sense. And this is actually the place where it's been commemorated for the last 1,600 years. The church that you see there in the middle, that I'm standing in front of, is a Roman Catholic church that was built in 1936. And it was right close to the 4th century Byzantine ruins that were discovered at this site. One of the things that archaeologists and scientists use to classify a site as an A site, a B site, a C site has to do with some of that layers of history. If you can find ruins or wreckage or things that say that this place was holy or venerated in the 2nd or 3rd century, chances are, that's probably a lot to say that people had been worshiping that site and venerating that site for years, for generations. And so that's part of why this was classified as the way that it was. Fun fact, Benedict Mussolini actually funded for the creation of this church. I thought that's pretty interesting, right? So one of the things that we did every day, yes, we attended Mass every day. I'm Catholic, if you hadn't figured that out by now. We attended Mass every day, but we also had our leader, Randy Malik, who's, again, the deacon of the church, who this is his company. He also gave us a reflection every day at one of the sites that we visited about that site, about the scripture, and kind of diving in deeper into what we were seeing. And at this particular site, what he and Shura, or who was our Jewish Israeli guide, did is they read the Beatitudes in Hebrew and in English, which is really cool to hear. I have a recording of it. Again, I wish I could share all of that with you, but I don't have enough time to really dive into it. But it was really, really cool. It was cloudy, it was raining this particular day, but even at the rain, even with the gardens and everything that we see, and you can't really tell, but the Sea of Galilee is right there. It's right on the other side of this hill. We were standing up there, and if it was a clearer day, you could have seen the beautiful blue of the sea, but it was right overlooking the sea. After we left Mount Beatitude, we went to Tabka. Tabka is a very small town, literally only 10-minute drive from Mount Beatitudes. The other thing that I didn't really grasp is everything is so close together. The Sea of Galilee is a lake, by our definition. I can see the other side of it. When we were standing on I guess it would have been the western side, you can see the eastern side. You can see the mountains on the other side of the sea. It really isn't that big. So Tabka was only about a 10-minute drive from Mount Beatitude. And this is the church of the primacy of Peter. Now, primacy, that refers to the position of Peter among the 12, right? He was considered the first or the disciple. So that primacy of Peter is where this church gets its name. And this is the site where Jesus appeared to Peter and some of the disciples after the resurrection. And he cooked breakfast on the shore, the Sea of Galilee. Do you remember the story? And this rock that you see here, it's inside the church. This church was built on top of and around this rock. And the rock extends through the outside of the church. It's a little hard to see in this picture, but it's all around here. The church is built right on top of it. This particular rock is called Mensa Christi, which means table of Christ. And this is supposedly the site. This is a B site, because there's a couple of places where they think this might have taken place. But this is where it has been commemorated for, this particular church was built in 1933, but there is a 4th century church that was found on this exact same site. And this stone was also inside the 4th century church. But this is where Jesus repeatedly asked Peter in John, I think it was chapter 12, verse 15, do you love me? Remember, he repeatedly asked him, do you love me? Do you love me? And what did Peter reply? Well, yes, Lord, of course I love you. You know that I love you. Well, then feed my sheep, tend my lambs. And so that's the site, and that's what this statue that you see here is built in the garden, is representing Jesus telling and giving instruction to Peter to basically build his church. This stone is also referred to as the place of the coals, which refers to the charcoal fire that was built to cook the fish. And there are signs all around this church. You're not allowed to get onto the rocks. You know how kids, right? What's the first thing you want to do when you see a big rock? Natalie, Goodell. What's the first thing you want to do when you see a big rock? Huh? You want to climb on it? And you want to put chicken nuggets on it. Note to self, there was actually chicken nuggets in Israel. I actually did see them. I did not have them, but I did see them. But the first thing most kids want to do, right, when you see a rock is you want to climb on it. So there's signs all around it saying this is holy ground. Like no one's allowed to climb on the rocks. There were not really many disappointed kids, but it was pretty cool to see. We then actually walked down the hill and around a corner in Tabka still, to the Church of the Multiplication. So this commemorates where Jesus fed the 5,000, the multiplication of the loaves and fishes. Tabka is derived from a Greek name, heptapagon, which means 7 springs. And there's these springs right in and around this particular area. The feeding of the 5,000 does appear in all 4 of the Gospels. And this is an A site. So there is a lot of evidence that this is the actual site where this miracle took place. There's actually 4 churches that have been built on this exact same site. And in each case, the altar is in exactly the same spot in all 4 of those churches. So that's what this diagram here represents. This little oval right there, that's the altar location. And so that altar is in the same spot in each of the 4 churches. The first one was built in 350 AD. In 480 AD, it was significantly enlarged, and a lot of floor mosaics were added, and they also built on an atrium. That church was destroyed by the Persians in 614 AD, and that 5th century church was rediscovered then in 1892, when excavations unearthed all of the mosaics from that original 5th century church. In 1984, the current church, which you see in the picture here, was constructed, and it reused the original mosaics from that 5th century. And I want to show you some of the mosaic floors that were there. It was absolutely, and this, we walked right on this. The way they restored this was very purposeful. So do you see the bright colors? The colors are the original 5th century mosaics. Everything that's kind of grayed out was done on purpose so that it allowed those other mosaics to kind of shine, right? So the stuff that you see that was patched in, so like right here, you can see the detail of this mosaic, and then this kind of grayed out dull, that's the new stuff that they added. So that these are floors that are just there now. Hundreds of thousands of pilgrims walk on them every single day. And that's 5th century church. There's a couple glass kind of, we can't walk over to this particular spot, but underneath this is the remains of the 4th century church that was still there. And it was really, really amazing. This incredibly tall, you can see the ceilings in this church, which is huge. This is the main altar here in the middle. And underneath the altar, there's a very famous mosaic, which I don't know if you can see. It's got a basket here. You see 2 fish on either side of the basket? Okay, inside that basket, there are 4 loaves. How many loaves were there supposed to be? 5. There are 5 loaves. But this mosaic only depicts 4. And that is because the 5th loaf, you can't see it, is on top of the altar, because that's where you share in the supper of the Lord. And you can, if you Google multiplication mosaic, that's the mosaic that you will see, is this mosaic of the 4 loaves in a basket with the 2 fish flanking it. It was really, really cool. And that was original 5th century mosaic that is still there. And they didn't have to touch that one. It was still perfectly preserved when they uncovered it. Pretty cool. So after we left Tabka, we took, again, a very short bus ride to Capernaum. Capernaum, is how it's pronounced in Hebrew. It actually means village of comfort. How appropriate, right? To be the place where Jesus decided, when he was basically shunned and kicked out of Nazareth, where he wanted to do his ministry was in Capernaum, the village of comfort. This particular town is actually divided. There's a wall that separates the property owned by the Greek Orthodox monastery from the Franciscans. Okay, so the first part of what I'm going to show you is on the Greek Orthodox side. Okay, so it's all part of Capernaum National Park. When you walk in, this is the Greek Orthodox side. It's these beautiful fruit trees everywhere. Everywhere we went, lemons and oranges and persimmons and limes and just amazing fruit and agriculture everywhere. You can't really tell, but there's a peacock walking around, just strutting her stuff. I have no idea what this tree is, but it was so cool. The trunk and the branches, they were like almost like sails. They were huge. I don't know what type of tree it was, but it was really, really cool. This is the inside of the Greek Orthodox Church. And when I say every inch of the walls and ceilings were covered with icons, every square inch was covered. These icons were used to educate basically people who couldn't read. You know, the artists who created icons were actually called writers because they were writing a story and they were telling a story. So I'm going to talk about just a few of the stories that we see. This particular story right here is when Abraham and Sarah were told that they were going to bear a son. And they were visited by 3 angels, potentially. This one in the middle is Abraham and Isaac's story. So when Abraham and Isaac are marching up to the top of the hill where Abraham's going to sacrifice Isaac, and then here's where God says, stop. Which, fun fact, has anybody seen His Only Son? It's in movie theaters right now, and it's this story. It's put out by Angel Studios, which is the same company that is producing The Chosen. Has anybody seen The Chosen? I highly recommend it. I actually watched the first 2 seasons before I went to Israel, and since then the 3rd season has come out, and they're starting to film the 4th season now. If you don't know about The Chosen, it's completely crowdfunded, and it's free. And it's free on purpose, so that nobody has any issue seeing it. So I highly recommend it. A lot of the places they talk about, I got to see, which is really cool. This is the story that we just talked about at the primacy of Peter. So this is Jesus appearing to the disciples after the resurrection, and Peter jumping out of the boat when he recognized it was the Lord, and swimming to see Jesus on the edge of the shore. This is a representation of the last days. This is Abraham and Sarah. This is the throne by which we will be judged. This is the river that separates, where they're separating the souls who are going to purgatory or to hell versus those that are saved and joining the saints in the heavens. This is a story of the paralyzed man being lowered down through the roof of Peter's mother-in-law's house for Jesus to heal. And I could literally talk about this forever. All of the stories that you ever have seen in the Bible were somewhere on these walls. It was really, really incredible. And it was a fairly large church to be in the middle of Capernaum. Let's see. Some of the other things that you can see here, just the ornamentation, and everything was gold and glittery, what you would think of in a Greek Orthodox, right? Very elaborate, very overstated almost. But it was really, really pretty. And then we move to the other side of Capernaum, and this is where they uncovered the ruins of the city. The primary focus point here is the remains of a synagogue that they uncovered. So this picture right here is the wall of the synagogue. Now, can you notice the difference between the foundation rock and the rock on the wall, right? This is limestone. This is basalt. Limestone is not native to this part of Israel. This was shipped in from Rome when the Romans came in and rebuilt the synagogue. The basalt is the foundation of the original 1st century synagogue that was there when Jesus lived in Capernaum. So that is the foundation of the synagogue that Jesus would have taught in Capernaum. It is still standing. And it's funny, up here, the 2 line up, but as you go further towards the sea, they're apart by almost 1.5 feet. And that's because when they rebuilt the synagogue, it needed to be facing exactly towards Jerusalem. And it was just a little bit off. So they fixed it. So that the synagogue faced Jerusalem, because that was, in the time, that was the rule, right? All the synagogues had to face Jerusalem. And so it was just a little bit off when the 1st century builders had built it. So that was very cool. And you see, just these are all ruins. And again, I feel like I'm shortchanging the stories because I am a little bit. There's so much I could talk about here on what the synagogue used to look like. Capernaum was a very large fishing village. It was obviously home to St. Peter. It was also home to Matthew, the tax collector. And so these are just some of the houses, the ruins. that they found, now you can't walk down in there for obvious reasons, but just the fact that this is all restored, it was obviously, they excavated this whole area. There is a large portion of Capernaum that is still not excavated yet. It's still an active site. So they're still digging, they're still uncovering more parts of the city. This was a very large town for the time period. So this is only a portion of it. When they were doing the excavations, a lot of which happened in the 1960s, there was one first century house that was discovered that they found evidence of a previous church being built over top of this particular house. And there were markings that were found on the exterior of the walls. Those markings have been replicated in the exterior of this current church. So this is the church that has now been built over top of that particular house that they discovered in the 60s. These markings indicate that this was the home of St. Peter. And this is where Jesus stayed and lived when he was in Capernaum. Technically, this is the house of Peter's mother-in-law. If you remember the story, Jesus healed his mother-in-law and then stayed with Peter in their house. This is also the house where the paralyzed man was lowered through the roof. And this, what you see underneath here, is the remains of that first century house that we were able to see. And it's underneath this church. So it's a Catholic church built on top. In the middle of it, there's a glass floor that you can look straight down into this existing first century house. So there's a lot of things in and around Capernaum celebrating St. Peter and celebrating Jesus' ministry in Capernaum. Again, I wish I could go into all the details. But yes, absolutely an A site. Absolutely. Okay. I know I'm bouncing fast. I'm sorry. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. The next site I want to talk about is in Magdala. Magdala is where Mary Magdalene was born and raised, where she's from. This particular site that you see was excavated when the monastery that currently is there in Magdala was breaking ground to build a new hostel so that theology students could come and study in Magdala and in around Galilee. And they discovered the earliest first century intact synagogue in the Holy Land. There are some specials online that actually talk about the synagogue. And while we were there, they were starting to excavate on the other side of the road. And they are suspecting that there's some more evidence for another synagogue that was built at a different time period that is across the road. They haven't quite dated that one yet, but everywhere you go in the Holy Land, you see construction crews. You see excavation, because they're still finding things. Pretty much you put a shovel in the ground somewhere and you're going to find something. It's pretty incredible. So this particular synagogue had a lot of original mosaic floors. A lot of the original ornamentation was still very visible on the walls of the synagogue. And one of the greatest finds that they had here was what they call the Magdala stone. This is a replica. This particular one is a replica. The original is actually inside the Magdala Hotel, which is right next door to where this was. But this was a replica that we saw outside. And it's notable because the carvings that you see on the Magdala stone are the exact carvings that were in the Second Temple that was destroyed in 70 AD. So this was created before the temple was destroyed, which makes it very significant. The other thing that is very significant is this menorah that is on the edge of the one side of the Magdala stone. This was the earliest known image of a temple menorah to be found in a synagogue, right? The way the Jewish tradition held is that you, once a year, traveled to the temple, right? Well, and you didn't necessarily worship in a synagogue. You read stories, you talked about the word, but you didn't necessarily worship in a synagogue. And so there's a lot of scholars now that believe that that's actually not accurate, that they actually did worship in a synagogue and not just a temple. So this particular stone was found in the middle of the synagogue, and it was high enough so that it would have been used as a reading desk by the priest or whoever was there in a seated position, because that's how they typically read. It was really, 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 really cool. The other really cool thing, there's so many, so much, also in Magdala is a church called Duken Altum. Duken Altum is Latin, and it stands for put out into the deep. And these are the words that Jesus said to Peter when he first encountered Peter, prompting him to go out into deep water and lower his nets. This is kind of and this whole church is built in and around the idea of fishermen and also the women of the Bible. So, and again, I don't have pictures of it, but all of the pillars on the inside of the atrium in Duken Altum have all of the famous women of the Bible carved into the pillars. And there's a statue outside of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. The altar of the church is actually a fishing boat. And if you look out from the fishing boat, you're looking out to the Sea of Galilee through that big window that's behind it. And so when the light hits it right, it looks like the altar is floating on the sea. It's really, really cool. There's still one more thing that's really cool about Magdala. This is in the basement of Duken Altum. It's this beautiful entire wall of this mural. Does anybody have a guess as to what this story is depicting? That's what we said too. That's not it. It's not Jesus washing the feet. Say that again? They have their sandals on, right? So do you see the hand that's coming out? Mom got it. This is the story of the women who suffered from the issue of blood, who said, if I can only touch the hem of his garment, I will be healed, right? So it's in Mark chapter 5, and it's the woman who had been suffering from bleeding for 12 years. Now, this is what's really amazing about this story. Keep in mind the Jewish customs at the time that this occurred. Women were considered unclean during that time of the month, if you know what I mean, right? They were not to be touched during that time. So if someone touched them, they had to go bathe. They had to go cleanse themselves because they were unclean. Imagine suffering for 12 years without any human contact whatsoever. 12 years. You talk about suffering. She was shunned. If people saw her in public, they would run to the other side of the street so they wouldn't risk encountering her or touching her. Yet her faith was so strong that she truly believed that she had just touched his garment, she would be healed. And if you read the scriptures, Jesus knew the moment that she touched him. And keep in mind that she would have been absolutely terrified. So what did he say? He said, who touched me? They're like, Jesus, you're in a crowd. Like, everybody touched you. He's like, no. Who touched me? And she had to have the courage to say, it was me, right? Because what would have happened to her? She would have been stoned. People would have yelled at her because now she's made Jesus, she's made the prophet unclean. How horrible a thing could that have been? But she confessed, and Jesus told her, daughter, thy faith has made you whole. Go in peace and be free of your suffering. I loved this story. I love that mural. And I don't have a good picture of it to show you, but the floor that is in this basement where this mural is the original floor. It's the original street from the first century. So that is the street that Jesus and the disciples and Mary Magdalene and everybody you hear about walked on that street. So it's funny, our guide Shira, she was like dancing all around. She's like, if you go over here and you go over here, you touched every place that Jesus touched. Like he walked right here. It was pretty cool. All right, so the next day, we get in the bus and we take a fairly long drive out to the Mediterranean Sea, to Caesarea Maritima. So this is the Mediterranean that you see out here in the distance. It was absolutely gorgeous, so pretty. This town was built between 22 and 10 BC by King Herod. The addition of Caesarea to many towns was meant to draw the favor of Caesar. So a lot of kings and a lot of prefects in and around the provinces would name towns Caesarea to try to draw the favor of Caesar. This is a port town and included a very large harbor by which goods were shipped back and forth to Rome. This upper right where am I at? Okay. So where am I at? What picture? This right here. So what you can see on this is the arena. I know it's a little hard to see. It's kind of a far away, but these are stands over here on this side. There would have been stands on the other side, but the sea kind of reclaimed some of that. This right here is the remains of the arena, not the arena, what's the word I'm looking for? The theater that Herod built, okay? This is the floor of Herod's palace. It was right on the edge of the sea. And this is my good friend Mike Zarina, who took one for the team and volunteered to demonstrate a very rare find. This is on the entrance into the arena. So if you've ever been in an arena, what do you see everywhere? Bathrooms. That's the toilet on the way into the arena. They were open air. People just stopped along the side. Of course, consider this is all men, right? There were no women. Women didn't go to the arenas. But yes, that's a toilet. I thought it was funny. So this theater that you see here, that Herod built, was the first of its kind in Israel. Throughout the Roman and Byzantine periods, this building underwent several alterations. Somewhere between the 3rd and the 4th century AD, the orchestra area was converted into a large basin for nautical games, is the best way I can describe it. And apparently, the Christian Byzantine rulers did not appreciate the often licentious entertainment that happened in said nautical games. They closed it down in the 5th century. But there are definitely some interesting stories that we heard at this particular location. A couple more shots of Caesarea Maritima. What you see over here, this is Shira, she's our guide. She's standing in front of a sarcophagus. And so sarcophagus, this one was discovered here at this site, and it was engraved with an inscription that said the grave of Procopius the deacon was in this sarcophagus. Sarcophagus, I didn't know this, actually stands for flesh eater. Did you know that? So the way it works is obviously they put a body in a sarcophagus until the flesh is eaten away, and all that's left are the bones. So then the bones are taken out and are put into an ossuary. An ossuary is a small, probably a little bit bigger than the lectern here. That's where the bones are stored, because then they reuse the sarcophagus for the next person. And a lot of times in and around where a tomb will be, that tomb was basically like a sarcophagus. They would allow the body to decompose until the bones were left. In a lot of tombs, you would see small niches carved. That's where the ossuaries would go. And then they would reuse the tomb. If you remember the story of Joseph of Arimathea, that was a familiar tomb. That was a family tomb that they had just carved. So they would use it for everybody from that family. Their bodies would be removed, bones put in an ossuary, ready for the next person. That's how that worked. Thought it was interesting. This is really cool. Now, I don't know if you can read this, and the middle picture kind of gives it away, but this stone, right here, Pilate, anybody guess who that is? Pilate, Pontius Pilate. This stone fragment was actually reused in the 4th century in a stairwell behind the stage house of that theater, where it was discovered in 1961, and it was part of the steps. This is the earliest surviving and the only contemporary record of Pontius Pilate in existence. The inscription reads, and it's obviously they pieced it together. Pontius Pilate, the prefect of Judea, erected a building dedicated to the Emperor Tiberius. And this is the actual stone that was found. This is in the Israeli Museum in Jerusalem. This is a replica that we saw at Caesarea Maritima. And Pilate, as you know, was the prefect of Judea from 26 to 36 AD, and likely would have made his home base in Caesarea Maritima, as it had been replaced. It replaced Jerusalem as the administrative capital of Israel, and also the military headquarters in the year 6 AD. So this is where he would have lived, and he would have traveled to Jerusalem if he needed to. but for the most part, he would have lived right here in Caesarea Maritima. So that was pretty cool. All right, we're fast forwarding to Nazareth. Now this is actually, we are in the city of Nazareth in a place called Nazareth Village. This is an open-air museum that reconstructs and reenacts village life of what it would have looked like at the time of Jesus. The village was founded in the year 2000, and it features houses and terraced fields and olive presses, wine presses, farmers, craftspeople, everybody who would have lived and worked in Nazareth at that time. One of the greatest stories that we saw, and I am not going to do this justice, so forgive me in advance. Our guide was very eloquent and explained the significant correlation between the process for making olive oil and Jesus' suffering at Gethsemane. So I'm going to give you the Cliff Notes version of this. I'm not going to do it justice the way he did. The Garden of Gethsemane is, in fact, an olive grove. Gethsemane is Aramaic, and it means olive press, is what Gethsemane means. Olives are first crushed by a masher. That's what this is. They would have attached a donkey to that wooden post sticking out the side, would have walked around in a circle, crushed the olives to create a mash. That mash is then placed in baskets that are pressed with these large stones. This whole lever would come down and press and get the olives, or the oil, out of the olives. That's how they extracted the oil. You see these little grooves in the stone here. That's where the oil would have poured out, and they collected underneath. The first pressing produces what we now know of as extra virgin olive oil, right? That's the first pressing. That was used for anointings in the temple. The second pressing is used for food and for medicine. And the third pressing was used for heating and lighting. So in the Gospels, Jesus went forward and prayed 3 separate times. The immense pressure that he was under in the garden is recounted by Luke chapter 22. Being in much anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. And he went on to talk about the significance of the 3 different prayers that Jesus went out and prayed, and how that ties back to the different types of oil and how it's used in different pressings. Again, I can't do it justice, but it was just really interesting to hear that. I had not heard that before. But the definitely correlation between olive oil and the garden. So obviously when we were in Nazareth, one of the biggest places we wanted to see was the Basilica of the Annunciation. This is the largest church, largest structure in Israel. It's built between 1960 and 1966, and it is built over the childhood home of the Virgin Mary in Nazareth. St. Helena, who was the mother of Constantine, helped construct a number of churches in and around the Holy Land that commemorated important sites in Jesus' life, including this one. The original, that is actually inside and part of this structure, was built in the year 570 AD. And so a few pictures of inside. This is an absolutely gigantic church. It's 2 stories. And the upper level contains the main sanctuary. We were blessed enough to celebrate Mass in the main chapel, which was an honor that we were not expecting. The whole walls are covered with images of Mary. Many of them are from mosaics, and they're all sent and given to the church from different countries around the world. There were so many that the courtyard now around the Basilica is used to display all these icons and all these glorious pictures and depictions of the Virgin Mary. On the outside of the church, and it's not visible here because it's really hard to see, but carved into the front facade here, there is I'm going to try to pronounce this. It's in Latin. Verbum caro factum est ad habitati e nobis. That is on the facade of the church. And what that means, that is from John chapter 1. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us, is what is carved on the outside. So this is the inside of the church. This is the first floor. The second floor is up here. This is where we celebrated Mass. And this is where the grotto, and that's what you're looking at here. This is the childhood home of Mary. And there's a saying underneath this altar, and it's that same verse, but there is one additional word that is added into what you see under the altar. And that is the word hic, H-I-C, which means here. This is the place where the word became flesh. So, pretty cool. I get goosebumps even now talking about it, because it was truly incredible to realize where you were standing and what happened at that site. Very, very cool. We actually got an opportunity to take a little detour, and this was not part of our original tour plan, but our petition was granted kind of at the last minute, and so we took a detour to the Sister of Nazareth Convent. Probably not something that would have been high on my list to see, right? But we actually got a real treat. Our wonderful French guide, Magdalena, explained that this convent was established in 1881 by a group of French nuns, and as they were looking to increase the size of their house, they started digging down and excavating the floor, and they uncovered some archaeological remains. There was a Crusader-era church that they discovered, and it was actually built over a residential house. That house was dated back to the year 50 BC. The door on the left, right over here, takes you out to what would have been the original street of Nazareth. Okay? Further excavation uncovered a familial tomb, complete with the niches where the ossuaries would have been stored. That's what these niches are here. Okay? As they started researching this site, they uncovered reference to the burial place of the just man. Does anyone recognize that reference? The just man. So from Matthew chapter 1, verses 18 and 19, now the birth of Jesus Christ took place in this way. When his mother Mary had been betrothed to Joseph, before they came together, she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit. And her husband Joseph, being a just man, and unwilling to put her to shame, resolved to divorce her quietly. So the current thinking is that this is the home that they unearthed of the Holy Family. And that this tomb is where Joseph was laid to rest. And because Jesus was a tekton, Jesus was not a carpenter. You don't find trees in Israel. Everything is stone. The biggest tree you can find is probably an evergreen tree. Maybe it makes great furniture. It's not great for building houses. All of their houses were built out of stone. So Jesus was a builder, a tekton. And as a builder, he would have been the one to carve the tomb for his earthly father. So the belief, the current thinking of scholars is that this is the tomb that Jesus would have carved for Joseph. And that house that was discovered was the house of the Holy Family, which is really cool. This is a B, but only because there wasn't a lot of evidence to say when Joseph died. You don't hear a whole lot about Joseph, right? You hear about him when Jesus is a young child. But then when he's an adult and he's in his ministry, he's gone. So there's not a lot of scriptural evidence that points to when Joseph would have died. Would he have been in this area? We know that Jesus was no longer welcome in Nazareth. At some point in time, Mary left, but we don't know when. And that's the only reason it's a B, because they don't have the scriptural evidence to point to it being an actual location. Okay, now we're going to go way north, okay? This particular site, I could probably talk for 2 hours. How am I doing on time? You guys yell at me if I'm getting too long or too wordy, okay? This is part of the Tel Dan Nature Preserve, which is on the outskirts of Caesarea Philippi. The depiction that you see here on the right shows that this used to be a pagan sanctuary to the god Pan in Greek mythology. It's really hard to see, but this main temple right here was built in front of the cave that you see. In Greek mythology, This cave was considered the entrance to Hades, the gates of hell, is what this cave was remembered to be. And from this cave sprung the river Styx in Greek mythology. Today we know that river is the Jordan River. Came out of this cave. Now there was an earthquake a number of years ago, and the actual spring shifted a couple thousand yards south. So it doesn't emanate from this cave anymore, but it is very close. That spring is the one that is one of the springs that come together to form the Jordan River. And that, as I showed you before, goes south through the Sea of Galilee all the way down to the Dead Sea. Another really cool fact about this particular site, in Matthew chapter 16, verse 15, Jesus asked his disciples, what did he say at Caesarea Philippi? Who do you say that I am? Simon replied, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered him, blessed are you, Simon, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. This is the site that this happened at. It's very specifically referring to this rock and to those gates of hell when he said that. This site was amazing to me. The structure, the pictures here do not do it justice. I wish I could share all of the pictures with you. Very close to this site is Jeroboam's temple. Jeroboam and his rival, Rehoboam was the son of Solomon. He was this is where they divided the country of Israel into the northern and southern tribes. Jeroboam was the first king of the north. Rehoboam was the son of Solomon, and he had the tribes to the south. Jeroboam was fearful that his people would return to Jerusalem to pray, and therefore he would lose his people, right? Because Jerusalem was in the south. So this is where, in Dan, he created one of two golden calves to worship for his people. And this is an A site. This is actually the place. This is the platform that the golden calf would have rested on, overlooking the valley. Around the other side of the hill, they have uncovered what is called Abraham's Gate. This structure was the oldest thing that we saw when we were in Israel. It was built around 1750 BC. Almost 4,000 years ago, which is crazy to think about. And it was used by Abraham to enter the city Dan when he went to rescue his nephew, Lot, who had been captured. And the story is recounted in Genesis chapter 14. Very, very cool site. The next place we visited was Caesarea Philippi. This is the site where Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist in the River Jordan. So that is the Jordan River that you see right there. It is very dirty, very muddy, very small. That is the country Jordan on the other side of that river. We did see pilgrims on the Jordan side when we were there. Not exactly friends these days between Israel and Jordan. But thousands of years, we saw hundreds of baptisms while we were there. And we were there for maybe 2 or 3 hours. There were buses and buses and buses of people coming to get baptized in the Jordan. I do have a little bit of water from it, but it's very dirty. Not what I was expecting. Okay, so now we're moving down south to Qumran. Qumran is very much an active archaeological site and is located less than a mile from the shores of the Dead Sea. This is the site where the Dead Sea Scrolls were first found. And they were discovered in 1947 by a Bedouin shepherd boy who was searching for his lost goat. He went out looking for a goat that was lost, and he threw a stone down in a cave, thinking maybe the goat had fallen in. Well, if the goat hears the sound of the stone, he's probably going to make a noise, and I'll know the goat's down there. Well, instead, he heard the sound of breaking clay, and he crawled down in there and discovered this cave, which is now known as Cave Number 1, which is the first place that they discovered a broken pot full of scrolls. And to date, nearly 900 scrolls have been found in the surrounding mountainsides of this area. Again, I could talk for days about this site. The scholars believe, though, that there is a secretive Sadducean Jewish sect that lived here. They thought they were going to be the only ones they thought the end days were near, and that they were preserving the Hebrew Bible for posterity. And they hid the scrolls in the mountain because they were the chosen people who were going to survive the coming apocalypse. And so they would know where they hid the scrolls, which is why they went on into the desert, secreted themselves, and began creating copies of the Bible. Very, very interesting. The hottest day, it was like 95 degrees in the middle of the desert. It is definitely a desert. Okay, this was my first view of Jerusalem. We arrived in Jerusalem as the sun was setting, and it absolutely made for the perfect first glimpse of the city. This is a picture of the temple grounds. The golden dome that you see here is the Dome of the Rock, which is visible from the Temple Mount. This is actually an Islamic shrine at the center of the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. It is situated on the site of the second Jewish temple that was built in the year 560 BC to replace the destroyed, and it was destroyed, the second temple was destroyed by the Romans in the year 70 AD. The Dome of the Rock is the world's oldest surviving work of Islamic architecture. The first place we went in that evening was to the Israeli Museum in Jerusalem. And this was a really incredible sight. The first thing that we saw there was this outdoor model. And this is a model of what Jerusalem would have looked like in the year 66 AD, at the end of the Second Temple era. It's a 3D illustration of the landscape of the city in the first century. The model is a 1:50 scale, and it measures 22,000 square feet. It's commissioned in 1966, and obviously features what the Second Temple would have looked like and how large it was compared to the rest of the city. It's really, really huge. The other really amazing thing we got to see are the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is called the Shrine of the Book. It's also located at the Israel Museum, and it's home to the Isaiah Scroll. This dates from the 2nd century BC, and it is the most intact of all of the Dead Sea Scrolls. We were not permitted to take pictures inside, so the pictures that you see here I actually got online. This is what I saw, but we were not allowed to take pictures inside. So in order to show you what it looked like, I had to find some stock photos online. But that's the Isaiah Scroll. This is the top. This is a fountain, which is directly over top of the Shrine of the Book. And the top is shaped to look like the top of the clay pot that scrolls would have been stored in. And then inside, the scrolls are, the Isaiah Scroll is actually inside that display case that looks like it's part of a scroll. We also spent some time going through the museum. Again, I don't have time to show you all the pictures, but the Pilate stone was in there. A lot of other artifacts that we actually saw replicas of at various sites were all in the Israeli Museum. The next day, we went to Bethlehem. Now, Bethlehem is less than 10 kilometers from Jerusalem, but it might as well be another world away. It is under Palestinian control. So our Jewish guide, Shira, was not permitted to come with us into Bethlehem. There was huge red signs everywhere you looked. And I actually wrote this down because I thought it was kind of interesting. It was written in both in Hebrew, Arabic, and English. And it said, "This road leads to an Area A under the Palestinian Authority. The entrance for Israeli citizens is forbidden, dangerous to your lives, and is against Israeli law." And so that was everywhere. So there's definitely a division in Israel. We spent the morning, though, in Bethlehem at the Church of the Nativity. So this Basilica is the oldest in the Holy Land and is the oldest common site that is continuously used as a place of worship in Christianity. And this is Jesus' birthplace. The first basilica on this site was also commissioned by Constantine at the request of his mother Helen in the year 326 AD. And as you enter the basilica, this is the main entrance. It is a tiny little door referred to as a door of humility. I think even Natalie would have to duck to get in this door. We had to basically almost get on your hands and knees to go into the door. It was very, very short. Nathan, you would have had to crawl. The Grotto of the Nativity is an underground space which forms part of the crypt of the original church. We were each permitted to kneel down and reach into this hole. That is underneath that floor is the stone that Mary is said to have laid on when she gave birth to Jesus. This hole is surrounded by a 14-pointed star on the floor. And the significance of the 14 points represents the 3 sets of 14 generations in the genealogy of Jesus. So the first 14 are from Abraham to David, and then from David to the Babylonian captivity, and then from then to the birth of Christ. 3 sets of 14 generations. So this is the steps going down into the grotto. This is A. This is A. There is so much history and evidence of this site. The number of churches and then just everything you see here in the Nativity points to this site. Really, really amazing. So we're going to fast forward from the birth of Christ to the suffering at the Garden of Gethsemane. This garden is at the foot of the Mount of Olives, and this is where Jesus underwent his agony before his arrest and crucifixion. The church here is called the Church of all Nations, because all the nations where Christianity exists sent money to help build this church and preserve this site. The Church of all Nations was built over what is called the Rock of Agony, and this is where Jesus went to pray during the night. So it is truly a beautiful, peaceful olive grove. This particular olive tree that I'm standing in front of is 2,000 years old. So this olive tree would have been in the Garden of Gethsemane when Jesus was there. It was really, really, and the church is purposely kept dark all the time. The only lights in the church are the lights that you see here in the area and the candle that's lit on the stone. So we got a lot of nice quiet time in the church when we were here. It was really, really peaceful. So then the next morning, we got up very, very early to head into the old city of Jerusalem because we wanted to visit the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It opened at 8 a.m. and we wanted to be the first in line by 7:30 so that we didn't have to wait too long to go in to see the tomb. So these are some of the pictures that I took as we walked through the old city. All of the shops and everything were still closed. So it was about 7 o'clock in the morning when we walked through the old city to get to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This dates from the 4th century and contains, the current structure dates from the 4th century and contains 2 very holy sites. It contains Calvary, or Golgotha, as well as Jesus' empty tomb. The tomb itself is enclosed by this shrine that was built in the 19th century. This is called I'm going to pronounce this wrong, edicule is how it's pronounced. On the side of the edicule, there is a hole in the wall, and the priest would enter at the Easter Vigil, which is the night before Easter, and the tradition is that he receives the light from heaven, which then is passed out this hole and spread to the hundreds of thousands of people that are gathered in and around this church. At my church, we reenact this at the Easter Vigil. So the Easter Vigil is my favorite Mass of the year. It's about 3 hours, so you gotta take a nap in the afternoon. It starts at 8 o'clock. Usually you get home about a little after midnight. But it's the same reenactment, where we light the Easter candle. The way we do it, we burn last year's palms from Palm Sunday and light the Easter candle. And then throughout the whole church, it starts in darkness, and we pass the light through the church to reenact the light of Christ. We were not permitted to take pictures inside the tomb. And they only let 5 people go in the tomb at a time. It's very small. It's intended to be obviously very reverent. But each of us had an opportunity to go in, lay your hand on the stone. It's part of the tomb where Jesus' body would have laid. Very, very cool. Very cool. after we left the tomb, we went up to see Golgotha. It is inside the church, and you have to climb a series of stairs to actually get up to where it is. Originally, at the time of Christ, this place was outside, just outside the walls of Jerusalem. This is a picture of the stone. I don't know if you can tell or not, but there's glass encasing the stones. And the altar is built over top of the center stone. Inside the stones were holes where the crosses would have stood. Okay? And under that altar, this is actually a friend of mine took this picture, that's me, underneath the altar, and you can reach your hand inside a hole, and you can reach down and you can touch the stone where the cross stood. The other, because obviously he was crucified with two other people, the other holes in the stones were on either side of that altar, and that's what this is right here. This is one of the stones. The other one's on the other side, over here. We talked a lot about the instruments of torture. Obviously, Jesus went under a great deal of suffering before his crucifixion. This is what the nails would have looked like. They were like that long. Huge, huge spikes that would have been driven into his hands and his feet. These are what he would have been flogged with when he was flogged. They do not look very kind. And in reality, this is what the crown of thorns would have looked like. It was not a circle. We actually saw the tree that produced the thorns that would have been used for the crown of thorns. It's more like a hat that sat on top of his head. That tree is called Spina Christa, the spine of Christ. And it was picked because it has two different types of thorns. There's a long straight thorn, and then there's a curved hooked thorn. So that curved hooked thorn would have grabbed in a hold of skin and not have been able to pull out, which is why it was selected for the crown of thorns. Okay. I know I'm going fast. I'm sorry. This is the Western Wall, the Wailing Wall. This is actually, it's not a wall of the temple, which is what I thought it was. This is the last remaining portion of the retaining wall for the Temple Mount. The larger stones that you see on the wall here, there's 17 courses of them. Those are below street level, and those stones are from the time of Herod the Great. Because of the strict entry restrictions for the actual temple, this is the closest place that Jews are permitted to pray outside of what would have been the Temple Mount. And the Temple Mount, in the temple, why it was so venerated is this is where the Holy of Holies, which is the most sacred site in the Jewish faith. The inner sanctuary of the tabernacle is where God's presence appeared. According to Hebrew tradition, the area was defined by 4 pillars that held a veil covering the Ark of the Covenant. And the ark was held up above the floor. And the ark contained the 10 Commandments, which were given by God to Moses on Mount Sinai. The Temple of Jerusalem was said to have been built by King Solomon. This is the first temple, explicitly for the purpose of preserving the Ark of the Covenant. So this is the most holy site in the Jewish faith. We all did get permission to go into and go up to the Wailing Wall. Women and men had to enter 2 separate entrances. Men had to have their head covered. We brought scarves. The women brought scarves to cover our heads. And we did get to the wall to put a prayer into the cracks. This is the tradition at the Wailing Wall. I mean, people spend their entire day sitting, praying at the wall. But we all got an opportunity to go up, approach the wall, and put our prayer in one of the cracks. It was really, really cool. I know I keep saying everything's really cool because it was. One of the real opportunities that we got a chance to do was to walk the Via Dolorosa and perform the Stations of the Cross along the way. So this is the path that Jesus would have walked and carried his cross through the streets of Jerusalem to Golgotha. The spots are marked along the way with signs that talk about each station. This is the cross that we carried. The marketplace was loud, it was crowded, there were people talking all over the place, and so it was very difficult a lot of times to navigate. It's very narrow walkways to navigate this cross with our whole group getting through the streets, which probably was very reminiscent of what happened when Jesus had to carry his. This is St. Peter Gallicantu. Anybody guess what this location is about? This is going to be a tough one. Gallicantu is Latin for cock's crow. That sound familiar? This is the palace, it's built on top of the palace of Caiaphas, which was the Jewish high priest who sat in judgment over Jesus, and where Peter denied Christ 3 times in the courtyard. Inside the church, inside the basement of the church, there's a cistern where Jesus would have spent the night. And outside in the back is the courtyard where Peter waited while Jesus was inside on trial, where they would have had the fires and where everybody said, hey, weren't you with him? Like, I don't know what you're talking about. And so there's the steps that Jesus would have walked down to leave Caiaphas' house as he was being taken out are still standing outside the house. Really powerful, really cool sight. This was a little bit of fun. I'm almost done, I promise. We had a little fun with this story. So let's see if you can guess this one. It involved a young boy and a giant. David and Goliath, right? So we just happened to have a youth. Randy, who was our guide, his son Joe, who was 15, accompanied us on this trip. And so we reenacted the Battle of David and Goliath. So as Vicki read from 1 Samuel, chapter 17, Shira pointed out the landmarks that were all around us as you were reading through the story. Our young hero slew the giant, and then we all scoured the ground for flat, smooth stones. For David had gathered 5 smooth stones from the brook, but he only used one of them. So what happened to the other 4? Tradition is for tourists to come and take a stone from Elah Valley. And don't worry that the Israelis replenish the stones every few years. And it's so funny because this literally was just a random path on the side of the road that Yudi pulled the bus off to. We're like, why are we getting out here? There's nothing here. It's just a valley. But it was the story of the whole story, and all the mountains she pointed out are read right from the scripture. Very, very interesting. So, my friends, our trip ended in the port city of Jaffa, or Joppa, depending how you pronounce it. It's the same place. This is where Jonah tried to flee from the Lord, and this is also where Peter had his vision to take the gospel to the Gentiles. This was our last stop before heading back to Tel Aviv in a very long 12-and-a-half-hour flight back to Newark. We had our celebration meal in Jaffa, and then the bus took us straight back to the airport to fly home. So thank you very much for letting me share my stories with you. I appreciated the fact that Tim talked about stories this morning because I got to share some of mine. I hope I didn't bore you all too much. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them, but thank you very much for the opportunity. Appreciate it.